Welcome back to Tom's World Scale Model Series. In this episode, we undertake the construction phase of our Tamiya 1/35th scale German Steyr 1500A. If you enjoy programming on scale modeling, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Leave us a comment, like, dislike, or share the video with friends. Clicking the notification bell gives you alerts when we post new content, or visit the channel Tom's World for a friendly visit for a complete list of all our videos. In episode 1 of our Steyr project, our unboxing revealed a beautiful little kit complete with figures and diorama accessories. In the box we found expertly molded parts, foolproof kit design, and clear instructions. Our expectations were high for a worry-free build. Stay with us for this video journal as we follow step by step the build-up of this classic German World War II light transport vehicle. Our episode covers the entire process from construction, painting, and weathering. So sit back as we embark on this compelling and interesting journey. To start our build, I gather a few essential tools. This includes a sprue cutter, a couple of knives with fresh blades, a file, and a small selection of sanding sticks and various grits. I also set aside a plastic container with a secure lid to hold loose parts. The lid ensures parts don't get lost, and it also keeps the dust off. When dealing with small or delicate parts, I like to remove whole sections of the sprue. I then use a fine blade, maybe an X-Acto 10 or 11, to carefully cut the parts loose. This method prevents breakage or distortion. Notice I put pressure on the part with my other hand. This prevents the piece from flying off into the carpet. After removing the parts, it's a good idea to inspect them. We're looking for seam marks and pushpin scars. By studying the instructions and by dry fitting the parts, we ascertain which of these blemishes we have to clean up. We see quite a few sink marks on the frame, but they're hidden during construction. Thankfully, Tamiya has kept the visible side of the frame free of these unsightly sink marks. When using sprue cutters, if we cut the sprue gate too close to the part, there's a danger of pitting the surface. Here's the part with the sprue gate removed. The shearing action of the sprue cutter blades can cause stress cracks if the cut is too close to the part. No big deal on hidden parts, but pits like these on, say, a vehicle hood can ruin the look of the part, and additional filing and sanding are required to fill the pitting. To prevent the pitting when removing parts from their sprues, I'll place my cuts well away from the actual part, like in these examples. We then go in with a thin, sharp blade and slice the sprue gate so it's just barely raised off the surface. If the blade is sharp, we won't get any pitting. I appear to be breaking the rule never cut towards yourself, and my fingers are pretty close to the blade, but notice how I position my hands. This posture gives me precise control of the blade. I can still apply enough pressure to get a clean cut, but I limit the length of travel of the blade. This technique is not recommended for younger modelers or for people new to the hobby. Working carelessly can cause nasty and painful cuts. Always be careful and wary when working with sharp blades. To finish, we lightly sand the edge to give us a nice, smooth edge. These sticks have 2 grits of sandpaper on them, and they're perfect for this job. Here are more examples of how parts should look before they are assembled. Here are all the parts that are attached to the frame, including the muffler, differentials, drive shafts, leaf springs, and so on. They're all cleaned up and ready for assembly. The kit does have small parts. These towing hooks are a good example. We want to attach these as soon as possible so we don't risk losing them. During our unboxing, I thought these little indents were our hollowed out exhaust pipes. Not the case, however, as this side of the pipes is attached to the little stubs that run from the engine's manifold. The pins in their respective holes are nice build aids as they help us to align the parts when gluing them together. Our exhaust pipe is actually solid, so we'll hollow out its end. I start by removing any parting seam on the end of the pipe with a sanding stick. Then using a fresh and pointy number 11 X-Acto blade, I press it dead center to the pipe and spin it to create a shallow pilot hole. Then using a pin vise and a bit just smaller in diameter than our exhaust pipe, we carefully drill a shallow hole. The pilot hole guides our bit so it hits dead center and doesn't slide off as we apply pressure. A few turns of our pin vise and we get a convincing hollow pipe. I want to pose my front wheels in the turned position, but we can see that the posts on the front axle where the wheels attach are not posable. The solution is pretty simple. I glue on the hub first. I'll then make 2 cuts to create a triangle cutout. I can then bend the post slightly and glue it in place. I bend the posts in opposite directions, just like the steering on a real vehicle. Tamiya has a well-earned reputation for their kit engineering, and here's an example. See how the parts are keyed? They only fit together in one way. This eliminates guesswork and mistakes and makes for a solid joint. Here's another example. We can see the holes which made up with the little dimples. The mating aids are offset, which ensures that the parts only go together in the correct orientation. The wheels are built up with 4 parts, including the polycap, and they're easy to assemble. I originally thought the design of the wheels would alleviate the need to mask them when we paint, but this is not so. While the construction is easy, there is a noticeable seam, but now it makes sense that Tamiya put the seam on the inside of the wheels, as such a seam on the outside would be a real pain to fill. The back wheels are built up the same way. There is no seam on the front of the wheels and they look great out of the box. Since I couldn't paint a straight line by hand if my life depended on it, I'll have to use a mask when painting the wheels. For this I use an inexpensive circle template that's available at most craft or office supply stores. These templates are handy for a number of uses and they perform equally well as a paint mask. Jumping ahead a little, here's the result after painting using the circle template as a mask. If we're careful, we'll get little or no overspray. Otherwise, a little flat black enamel applied with a brush can easily hide any stray paint. There are knockout scars on the inside of the body sides, and some of them need to be leveled. I've used a soft lead pencil to color in the ones we have to take care of. Studying the instructions and dry fitting help to identify which marks need attention. I don't much like filling these kinds of blemishes, and if they're not seen in the final model, I'll leave them alone. Both the right and left sides of the body unfortunately have these sink marks. For shallow sink marks, I like to plane the surface with a sharp blade. There are many sizes and shapes available in the X-Acto brand line. For tight spots, this number 16 blade serves us well. It gets us most of the way there, but we'll need a few swipes of a sanding stick and progressively finer grits to finish. For slightly deeper sink marks, I'll usually use Mr. Surfacer 500. It's a fairly thick liquidy lacquer product that can be applied out of the bottle with a brush. It's too thin for fixing deep marks, but 2 or 3 coats were enough for the Steyr sides. Once dry, we sand the Mr. Surfacer with progressively finer sanding sticks. And here's the finished look. Any hint of the sink marks will disappear once our paint is applied. The nasty marks on the lower end are hidden by the passenger compartment floor, so I didn't bother filling those. The bench seat also has pushpin sink marks, as do the front seats. We found similar seat blemishes on Tamiya's Kübelwagen kit as we discovered in our build video. Jumping ahead a little to the near finished vehicle, we can see that the sink marks on the back of the seats are hard to see, but when viewed head on, our sharp-eyed judge may catch this one. Either fill that mark before assembly or stuff through storage in between the seats to hide it. Tamiya's Kübelwagen kit had sink marks on the windshield frame, so I was curious to see if the Steyr also had these. And sure enough, there they were. I decided to leave these alone to save time, but again, if you're entering your model in a contest, these sink marks should be tidied up. And like the Kübel kit, the Steyr also has sink marks on the side of the cabin doors. Some are sunk and some are raised. These will clean up. Thankfully, the sink marks are pretty subtle and their position makes it simple to get in with sanding sticks and progressively finer grits. With a little patience and elbow grease, these doors are ready for painting. Even at this late stage in the build, I hadn't decided what color to paint our steer. That German Africa Core fleshy paint scheme was intriguing. I had painted an SAS Jeep in that color a while back. It's a work in progress, but I dug it out of the collection for a look. It was nice revisiting this little model as it sat in my collection for a few years. It looks cool, but I'm no further to deciding whether to paint the steer in this pinky orange color. I like to put dents in my vehicles, and since the steer has thin sheet steel fenders, we'll place some here. I use a carving bit in my drill to carefully create soft craters. I then smooth the edges with fine steel wool. The effect is subtle and realistic. We can later, after painting, add shine to the edges with a dry brush or pencil to accentuate the effect. Time to tackle the grills. The instructions call for pieces cut to scale. I was curious to see how accurate Tamiya's instructions were, so as an experiment, I cut the paper to scale to test fit the pieces. The verdict? The pieces fit perfectly. Full marks again for the quality of Tamiya kit instructions. I'll use the paper pieces as templates when I cut the grill shapes out with sharp scissors. We can see that Tamiya gives us plenty of extra mesh material. I use CA glue to secure the mesh to the front of the truck body. The mesh material frays at the edges, so some care is needed when working with it. We also want to make sure no glue seeps beyond the inner edge of the grills. Although inaccurate, the grills look pretty good. Like all Tamiya kits, the steer practically falls together. The fit is that good. Tamiya kits also strike a balance, so the builder still gets great detail, but isn't bogged down with an overwhelming amount of parts. Here's an overhead shot of the entire steer kit. All the parts are cleaned up and I've completed some sub-assemblies. Everything is finally ready for painting. There isn't a high part count in this kit, but some of the pieces are tiny. These wiper motors are a good example. Handle them carefully as there are no extras in the box. Painting the model begins with a flat black enamel layer. I thin the paint heavily with mineral spirits and gradually build up with light coats. We want even, silky, smooth coverage on everything. For surfaces that I'll chip with hairspray, I'll coat them with a light layer of reddish-brown enamel. In this case, I use Model Master Rust enamel. The overspray illustrates the color. The rust color is sprayed on very thin. We want a subtle, slightly rusted metal look as a base coat for chipping. These parts then get a coat of hairspray, followed with a coat of Tamiya acrylic. I settled on Tamiya's XF59 Desert Yellow as a base coat. As for the pinky orange DAC color we considered earlier, I'll save that color for a future project. We use a stiff brush moistened with water to create chipping and a worn metal look. Here the interior floor is getting the business. The hairspray that's applied under the acrylic coat loosens as the water permeates the acrylic. We simply rub and scrape the acrylic paint to create chips and a worn metal look. Our black rust enamel undercoat stays put since it's water resistant. Next I apply a clear gloss acrylic coat over the parts. This coat seals in the chipping and the base color. It also allows my oil paint washes to flow over the surface. Weathering on the underbody starts with a pin wash in tints ranging from burnt umber to black. Once the oil paint is almost dry, we gently dab the pin wash with a large soft brush. This removes tide marks and blends and feathers the dark color edges into the base color. Here's the finished look on the underbody after blending. And here's the cockpit floor after chipping and pin washing. The hairspray chips look terrific, very realistic and in scale. The technique produces chips and a worn metal look that are hard to match with other methods. If you've never chipped with hairspray, it's a good idea to experiment with technique before applying it to your model. Since the results are very random, only experience can mitigate the unpredictability inherent in the method. Next, I apply some dark colors. I use oil paint in tones ranging from burnt umber to black. I apply this and blend it with a large soft brush. I create shadows, smudges, stains, exposed metal, and discoloration on the surfaces of the vehicle. Then with a very light tint blended with white and yellow ochre oil paint, I add highlights. This gives the panels a sun-faded look. It also gives the overall color of the surface a modulating, almost dappled appearance, provides depth and interest to the otherwise flat surface. Here are the interior body sides after our pin wash, shadow, and highlight coats. I'm mostly painting and weathering the exposed interior surfaces of the model. If I were to complete construction before painting the interior, these surfaces would be hard to reach. It's far easier to weather the interior when the pieces are loose. Next, I hand paint chips using a little dark gray enamel applied with a fine brush. I also like to add chips applied with a sponge. Any sponge will do. I roll a bit of it up into a loose ball, then I'll roughen the surface by tearing off little bits with tweezers. We then moisten the sponge with our dark gray enamel. Next, we dab off most of the paint, kind of like when we dry brush. Then we gently dab on our chips. We want tiny, delicate flakes. Apply them randomly and don't overdo it. Rotating the sponge from time to time helps to create randomness. Developing a feel for when it's enough only comes with experimentation and experience. And here's the look of our interior surfaces after chipping. To finish the interior, I'll rub my soft graphite pencil over some of the edges. I pick out edges where I've applied painted chips. This creates a realistic, bare, rubbed metal look. I buff the graphite on with the tip of the pencil. A fingertip also does a good job of buffing the graphite to a shine. And here's the worn metal look we're after. Time to tackle our dashboard and instrumentation. I had this Archer decal set in my stash, and as it happens, they fit well with the Steyr's dashboard. These decals can be applied to our model by either dry rubbing or water sliding. I'll use the water slide method. The set comes with this little sheet of wet slide paper. We first dry rub the decal onto the wet slide paper using a soft lead pencil. Once all our decals are transferred to the wet paper, we can cut them out and apply them to our model like any other wet slide decals. I then set the decals with microsol, then dab on some glossy clear acrylic to seal everything. There are 3 wooden boxes that get attached to the interior floor, and they have wooden tops. Here are the materials I'll use to simulate wood. I first hand brush on a coat of enamel buff color that I lighten with a little white. I then paint thin grain lines down the surface with a brown color that's darkened with black. These lines seem thick, but when we have a thumb in the shot for scale, we can see that they're very, very fine. I let the grain lines dry, then the surface is overpainted with Tamiya transparent orange acrylic. We're trying to simulate varnished oak, and I think the look is pretty good. To finish, we use a little burnt umber oil pin wash on the edges. These boxes then get glued to the cockpit floor. With our interior pieces painted and weathered, we can now build up the vehicle's body. The assembly is simple and the parts fit together perfectly. Chalk another one up for Tamiya Kit Engineering. I like to use graphite on my models. The material is perfect for creating a bare metal finish. The pencil is by far the easiest to use, but pigments and even tube graphite are great substitutes. To create our bare metal look, we start with a flat black enamel finish on our plastic. For larger flat surfaces like these wheel hubs, I can simply color the surface with my pencil. I press hard with the tip of the pencil. I can then further buff the surface with a cotton swab to get a nice shine. Here's the finished look. It does give us a convincing bare metal look. I use the same finish on the components that get attached to the frame underneath the vehicle. Here are the drivetrain and suspension parts ready for assembly. For the muffler and exhaust pipes, I use this Model Master Enamel military brown color as a base. The exhaust manifolds get the same color. Over top of this, I can dab my MIG rust colored pigments. The carriage frame, drivetrain, and other assemblies beneath the vehicle are illustrative of the magic that is a Tamiya kit. The engineers don't overwhelm the builder with parts. Rather, there are just enough assemblies to create a balance between detail and ease of construction. Other kits may clag on more detail, but for modelers interested in a light build while still maintaining a good level of detail, Tamiya kits are hard to beat. Having completed the interior, it was time to turn our attention to the exterior of the vehicle. Since I'll be doing a lot of chipping, I once again oversprayed my black shadow coat with a rust-colored enamel. This is followed by a coat of hairspray, then a coat of Tamiya XF59 Desert Yellow acrylic. I repeat the chipping process using water and a stiff brush to scrape at the Desert Yellow acrylic layer. Here's the bottom of the recovery track holder after chipping. We can create a warm metal look, chips, scrapes, and scratches. These are all hard to achieve using any other method. The Steyr's hood is curvaceous, and in order to get our decal to conform nicely to the surface, we use more of our decal setting solution. I use Microsol, but any brand will do. I apply several coats, and I roll a cotton swab moistened with setting solution over the decal, making sure to roll out any creases or air bubbles. With our exterior parts painted and chipped, everything gets a coat of clear gloss acrylic. This seals in the paint, chips, and decals. I use clear floor polish for the gloss coat. I then attach the front end of the body to the rest of the vehicle. Our model is finally beginning to assume the classic lines characteristic of the Steyr truck. The weathering process on the exterior starts with moisture streaks. I begin by painting lines down the sides of the vehicle using burnt umber, black, white, and yellow ochre oil paint. Then with a wide brush moistened with mineral spirits, I draw the streaks down in the direction that moisture would flow. Although I'm depicting a vehicle that served in the North African desert, wild temperature swings in the environment results in condensation. This moisture builds up on vehicles and runs down the sides, carrying with it dirt, filth, and grit. This creates subtle streaks, which we're replicating here. Here's the effect once the oil paint dries. It's subtle and the video camera barely picks it up, but the effect is realistic and really brings the surface to life. Next, I apply a pin wash. I use various tones of burnt umber to black oil paint, diluted heavily with mineral spirits. The gloss coat allows the pin wash to flow along edges, depositing colors into the nooks and crannies of the surface. Once the oil paint is sufficiently dry, we dab the edges with a soft brush. This blends and feathers the color, which removes hard paint edges and tide marks. Here's the look we achieve with our blended pin wash. Next, I'll add some highlights using a white oil paint mixed with a little yellow ochre. I use a large soft brush to gently dab and blend the color. Build this up gradually and don't overdo it. If done properly, we achieve a sun-faded look. The effect is subtle, but it creates a gently modulating surface. It also adds depth and gives the vehicle a dappled look. I also wanted to add a few deep chips. I first hand paint a few chips with a light buff colored enamel. We then hand paint inside these light colored chips with a very dark steel gray colored enamel. We're careful to leave a border of the light color. This technique gives us a three-dimensional appearance that looks very realistic. But go easy on these types of chips, since overdoing the effect can really spoil the overall look of the model. Time to give the vehicle seats some attention. To achieve the leather look I'm after, I mixed a little enamel brown, rust, and black together for my base coat. This was hand painted on with a brush. I then blend in shadows and the molded creases using burnt umber oil paint. Similarly, highlights are painted on and blended with a light brown colored oil. The seat then gets a thin coat of Tamiya clear orange acrylic, which I thin with alcohol. This process produces a realistic looking padded leather look. Like most kit decals, the colors in this kit are too stark. To knock the color down, we can overpaint the decals with a little burnt umber oil wash. Any earth-colored wash can be used. We can fade the decals even more by either dabbing dry sienna-colored pigment over them, or we can lightly overspray the decal with the base color we used on the rest of the model. I always finish the undersurfaces of my models. All the bare metal I depicted here is likely stretching the bounds of realism, but I really like the look, and it makes a great base for my pigment weathering. Here are the pigments I'll use to muck up the bottom. And here's the look after applying the pigments. For a more detailed look at applying pigments to running gear, check out our Hummel build video, part 3. The technique is covered in detail. So time to tackle our canvas roof. I started by giving the canvas roof a coat of Tamiya XF49 khaki, which in turn is sprayed with a gloss acrylic coat. The sculpting of the canopy looks great, but we'll accentuate it with highlights and shadows. I start by mixing a color in oils that matches the Tamiya khaki color. I mix red, green, and white to get khaki. We compare the painted canopy color with our swatch, and the match is pretty good. We then tint this color with white and black to get our highlight and shadow colors respectively. Here's the roof after painting and blending our highlights and shadows. I hand painted the leather straps with enamel. For the leather color, I used Model Master Brown mixed with Model Master Rust. A burnt umber pin wash finishes the straps. I knock down the shine by rubbing a tiny amount of sienna dry pigment over the entire roof. To weather the wheels, I prepare a fairly thick mixture of sienna pigment and alcohol. We then paint the road-touching surfaces of the tire with this mixture. The pigments lighten dramatically when dry. Then with a finger moistened with water, or we can use a cotton swab, we wipe the surface that touches the road to remove the pigment. This leaves caked on pigment that collects in the tire's recesses. The rest of the tire is then rubbed with a tiny amount of dry pigment. The pin wash weathering, chips, and caked on pigment gives us a very realistic look. Our model is nearly complete, so we'll take one last look before we attach the windscreen and other final touches. The windscreen is perhaps the trickiest assembly in this kit. The die-cut clear plastic windshield pieces fit perfectly within the unpainted sills, but after painting the sills, the clear parts needed a little filing on their edges to fit them snugly. For this I used a diamond file. I used white scenic glue which dries transparent to affix the clear parts within the sills. Don't use CA glue to build or attach the windshield, as CA fumes could fog the clear plastic pieces. I used 5-minute epoxy to fix the driver's screen to the main frame. The main frame then was glued to the truck hood with more 5-minute epoxy. The instructions provide a side view of the windscreen so we can get the correct angle when we attach the frames. The Tamiya Steyr 1500 kit was a delight to build. The parts practically fell together, and the kit's overall sculpting and styling faithfully captures the classic lines of the 1940s era type. While some Tamiya kits, like our Steyr, may not be the most detailed on the market, arguably they are the easiest to build. That makes the Tamiya line perfect for younger builders or for people new to the hobby. We encountered no problems during the construction, and other than the slightly inaccurate screen material on the engine air intakes, on the whole the kit is faithful to its subject matter, and it looks great right out of the box. With our Steyr fully built, we still have a box full of figures and accessories left over. Maybe one day, time permitting, our little truck will find a home within a desert diorama. And that'll do it for this episode of Tom's World Scale Model Series. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Be sure to check out our other scale model videos and stay tuned for new episodes which will be coming out in the very near future. As always, thank you for joining me, stay well, and all the best.